Saturday mornings used to smell like onions browning in a Dutch oven because supper took all day and nobody complained. Then, the microwave showed up on the kitchen counter sometime around 1985, and those slow-cooked meals started disappearing one by one. Number 14 on this list cost almost nothing because nobody at the butcher counter wanted the cut it was built on. And number 2 spent 8 hours in a low oven and came out so tender a child could pull it apart with a fork. These were suppers that needed time, and the microwave had no patience for any of them. So hit subscribe and come along because here are 25 forgotten slow-cooked suppers the microwave killed in the 1980s. Number 25. Neck bones and sauerkraut. Pork neck bones cost almost nothing at the butcher counter because most people walked right past them. You put a few pounds in the bottom of a heavy pot, layered sauerkraut over the top, added a quartered onion and enough water to barely cover, and turned the burner down low. 3 hours later, the meat had pulled itself off the bone in soft, fatty strands, and the sauerkraut had soaked up enough pork flavor to taste like an entirely different vegetable. German-American families in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin made this every cold week from October through March. The bones were throwaway cheap and the sauerkraut came from a jar. What you could not buy was the 3 hours of simmering that turned 2 cheap ingredients into something that warmed the whole house. When the microwave made reheating a pork chop feel like cooking, the neck bones disappeared from the case and the pot stayed in the cabinet. Number 24. Short ribs braised in tomato gravy. Beef short ribs were a working-class cut, fatty and tough, and nobody with a microwave had any use for them. You seasoned the ribs with salt and pepper, browned them in a Dutch oven until the fat rendered and the outside turned dark, then buried them under canned tomatoes, onions, garlic, and a splash of vinegar. The lid went on, 2.5 hours at a low temperature. The connective tissue dissolved into the tomato sauce until the meat fell off the bone at the slightest pull and the gravy turned thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. You served it over mashed potatoes or egg noodles and let the gravy do the rest. The cut cost next to nothing at the meat counter in the 1970s and fed a whole family from one pot. By the mid-1980s, the people who knew what to do with short ribs had mostly stopped cooking them, and the cut eventually became a restaurant dish priced at what it never would have been worth in the kitchens where it started. Before I go any further, for the folks who want more old recipes like these gathered in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 23. Sunday pot roast with onion gravy. The pot roast was the centerpiece of a meal that started before church and finished after it. You took a cheap chuck roast, seared it hard in a heavy pan, and set it in a deep pot with onions, carrots, potatoes, and enough beef broth to come up halfway. Then you put the lid on and let it go for 3 hours. By the time the family walked in, the house smelled like Sunday. The meat pulled apart with a fork, the onions had melted into a gravy that nobody had to thicken, and the potatoes were soft enough to mash with the back of a spoon right on the plate. You could not rush a pot roast. You could not check on it every 10 minutes without losing heat. And you could not replicate it in a microwave without turning the whole thing into shoe leather. When convenience took over the American kitchen, the 3-hour roast was one of the first suppers to disappear from the weekly rotation. Number 22. Pork hocks with white beans. A smoked pork hock dropped into a pot with a pound of dried Great Northern beans soaked overnight, a diced onion, and water to cover. 4 hours on a low simmer. The hock released its smoky fat into the broth, while the beans softened and swelled until the liquid turned thick and creamy without a drop of dairy. You fished out the hock, pulled the meat off in rough pieces, stirred it back into the beans, and served it with a chunk of cornbread on the side. Czech and Polish families in Nebraska and the Dakotas cooked this every week through fall and winter. By the late 1980s, the smoked hock section at most grocery stores shrank to a single shelf and then vanished. Number 21. Rabbit stew. Before the supermarket made chicken the default protein, rabbit was just another meat that showed up at the table when someone came home from the field with something in hand. You jointed the rabbit, browned the pieces in lard, and simmered them in a pot with potatoes, onions, carrots, and a few sprigs of thyme for 2 hours. The meat turned out pale and fine-grained, tender enough to pull from the bone, and the broth picked up a flavor that sat somewhere between chicken and something wilder. Rural families across the South and the Appalachian foothills ate rabbit stew as often as they ate beef. When frozen chicken breasts and microwave dinners filled the freezer, the rabbit stew pot went cold, and the field out back stopped being a grocery aisle. The microwave did not just change how Americans heated food. It changed what Americans believed food was supposed to ask of them. A supper that took 3 hours sent a message: this meal matters enough to wait for. A tray that took 4 minutes sent a different one: eating is a task, finish it, and move on. By 1990, nearly 9 out of 10 American kitchens had a microwave on the counter, and the meals that took all afternoon started falling away quietly. Nobody protested. Nobody organized a march for the Dutch oven. The slow-cooked supper simply stopped fitting into the evening. Both parents worked. The kids had practice. The drive-thru was open. The meals on this list did not lose a competition against the microwave. They lost the afternoon they needed because the afternoon stopped belonging to the kitchen. Number 20. Slow-baked lima beans with salt pork. Large dried lima beans soaked overnight, then went into a deep stoneware pot with a slab of salt pork scored to the rind, a diced onion, molasses, dry mustard, and just enough water to keep everything covered. The pot went into a low oven first thing in the morning and stayed there until supper time. 6 hours, sometimes 7. The beans turned creamy and the salt pork gave up its fat slowly, seasoning every bean from the inside. The top layer dried out just enough to form a crust that cracked when you pushed a spoon through it. New England families served this as a full Saturday supper with brown bread and coleslaw on the side. The dish survived 2 world wars and the Great Depression because it asked for nothing expensive, but it could not outlast the 1980s. When a bag of frozen lima beans and a microwave could put something on a plate in 4 minutes, nobody wanted to give a pot of dried beans an entire day. Number 19. Pepper pot soup. Philadelphia claimed this one, and the city held on to it for the better part of 2 centuries. Pepper pot was a tripe soup, honeycomb tripe cut into small squares, simmered for hours in a broth built from beef bones, onions, celery, potatoes, and enough black pepper to clear your sinuses. The old recipes called for veal knuckles too, which added body to the liquid as the collagen broke down over 3 to 4 hours of steady heat. Street vendors sold pepper pot from carts in Philadelphia as far back as the 1800s. The call was always the same: pepper pot, smoking hot. You could hear it early in the morning and late into the evening. The soup kept people warm in winter and fed them cheaply in every season. By the mid-20th century, pepper pot had moved off the carts and into home kitchens across the mid-Atlantic. Families in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and southern New Jersey made it with whatever tripe the butcher had on hand, and the recipe passed from one generation to the next without ever getting written down in a proper cookbook. The tripe was the sticking point. Cleaning and preparing it took time and a tolerance for handling something that looked nothing like the tidy cuts in the supermarket case. Younger cooks did not want to deal with it. Grocery stores stopped stocking tripe regularly, and the 3-hour simmer that turned those rubbery squares of stomach lining into something tender and rich asked for an afternoon that most families had already given away to the microwave and the freezer aisle. Pepper pot did not fade because it failed the people who ate it. It faded because the people who knew how to make it stopped passing the recipe down, and the next generation never thought to ask. Number 18. Beef roulade. Thin slices of round steak spread with sharp mustard, layered with strips of bacon, dill pickle spears, and sliced onion, then rolled tight and held shut with toothpicks or kitchen twine. The rolls browned in a hot skillet and then braised for 2 hours in beef broth until the tough round steak turned tender and the filling flavored the meat from the inside out. German-American families in the Midwest and the Texas Hill Country served rouladen on weeknight tables with egg noodles or boiled potatoes and a ladle of the braising liquid poured over the top. Each roll was a self-contained supper wrapped around a pickle, and nothing about it could be replicated in 4 minutes or less. When time left the kitchen, the rolling pin stayed in the drawer, and the rouladen stayed in the past. Number 17. Smoked turkey necks with field peas. Smoked turkey necks went into a pot with dried field peas, a diced onion, a couple of cloves of garlic, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. 3 hours on a low simmer. The turkey necks gave up their smoky flavor into the broth while the peas softened and thickened into an earthy gravy that clung to the rice you served it over. This was a staple supper in Black households across the rural South, the kind of meal that fed a family for 2 days on a protein that cost almost nothing per pound. The necks and the peas did their work on their own schedule, and when that schedule got replaced by a microwave countdown, the smoked turkey neck section at the grocery store quietly vanished. Number 16. Braised lamb shanks. Lamb shanks were cheap, tough, and full of connective tissue that turned into silk after 3 hours in a covered pot. You browned them in a skillet, set them in a deep baking dish with garlic, rosemary, canned tomatoes, and a cup of broth, covered the whole thing with foil, and let the oven do the work at 300 degrees. When they came out, the meat slid away from the bone and the braising liquid had reduced into something rich enough to pour over bread. Lamb shanks were common in Greek, Italian, and Irish-American kitchens all through the post-war years. The dish asked nothing except time, and time was the first thing American families traded away when convenience moved in and took over the counter. Number 15. Chicken fricassee. Not fried and not roasted. Fricasseed. You dusted chicken pieces in flour and browned them gently in butter, keeping the skin pale gold and nowhere near crisp. Then you pulled the chicken out, built a sauce from the pan drippings with onions, celery, a little broth, and a splash of cream, and laid the pieces back in. 90 minutes with the lid barely cracked. The chicken came out tender enough to fall off the bone, sitting in a silky white gravy that tasted like the best cream soup no one ever made from a can. Fricassee was a French word that crossed into American farmhouse cooking before the Civil War and stayed on kitchen tables through the 1970s. It asked for gentle heat, patience, and a whole bird, 3 things the boneless, skinless breast made feel old-fashioned. By the time the microwave oven sat on every counter in the country, the fricassee pan had already been packed away for good. Nobody sat down one evening in 1985 and decided to stop making slow-cooked suppers. What happened was slower and quieter than any single decision. The frozen food aisle doubled in size. Both parents started working longer hours. The school bus dropped the kids off at 3, and somebody had to feed them by 6. The slow cooker helped for a while, but even that required thinking the night before, and thinking ahead was losing ground to exhaustion. The microwave answered a question most families did not realize they were asking: what if dinner took no effort at all? The answer came wrapped in plastic on a divided tray. The food was hot, the kitchen was clean, but the house stopped smelling like supper at 3 in the afternoon, and nobody noticed what that cost until the pot in the cabinet had a layer of dust thick enough to write your name in. Number 14. Pork backbone stew. The backbone was the piece nobody in the supermarket wanted. After the butcher had taken the loin, the chops, and the ribs off the hog, what remained was a row of vertebrae with scraps of meat clinging to the joints and pockets of fat tucked between the bones. You could buy several pounds of it for what a single pork roast cost, and in the rural South, that was reason enough to put a pot on the stove. The bones went in with quartered potatoes, a diced onion, salt, pepper, and enough water to cover everything by an inch. Then you waited. 2.5 hours at a bare simmer. The marrow and the collagen seeped out slowly, turning the water from thin and clear into something rich, cloudy, and thick enough to stick to your lips. The scraps of meat loosened from the vertebrae and fell into the broth in small, tender pieces that mixed with the potatoes as they softened at the edges. There was no way to speed this up. The collagen needed low, steady heat to break down, and if you raised the flame, the meat tightened and the broth stayed thin. Families across Appalachia and the Deep South made backbone stew every fall and winter when hogs were butchered. The backbone was the cook's reward, the cut too humble to sell but too flavorful to throw away. By the mid-1980s, most supermarkets had stopped stocking pork backbones altogether. The cut did not fit in a display case built around boneless, plastic-wrapped portions designed to cook fast. Children who grew up eating backbone stew in the 1950s and 1960s can still describe the smell of that pot from half a century away, but most of them never taught their own children to make it. The hog butchering days were over, the backbone was gone from the store, and the kitchen had moved on to faster things. Number 13. Tripe stew with potatoes. Tripe had to be cleaned, blanched, and then simmered for at least 2 hours before it turned from rubber into something you could chew without effort. You cut it into strips, browned it with onions and garlic, added diced potatoes, canned tomatoes, and broth, and let the pot sit on low heat until the whole thing thickened into a hearty stew. Italian-American and Portuguese-American families across New England and the Mid-Atlantic made versions of this regularly. The texture was unlike anything else in the kitchen, soft and slightly chewy, with a mild flavor that absorbed whatever seasonings surrounded it. Tripe asked for patience twice, once in the cleaning and once in the cooking. The microwave generation wanted neither, and tripe quietly left the American supper table one kitchen at a time. Number 12. Lamb neck with root vegetables. The lamb neck was all bone and connective tissue, and the butcher practically gave it away because nobody under 40 had any idea what to do with it. You browned the pieces in a hot skillet, transferred them to a deep pot with turnips, parsnips, carrots, and a quartered onion, poured in water to cover, and let it go for 3 hours. The connective tissue melted away entirely and left small pockets of meat that were impossibly tender, and the root vegetables absorbed the lamb broth until every bite carried the same deep, earthy richness. Scots-Irish families across New England and the upper Midwest kept this in regular rotation through the 1970s. The neck was cheap, the vegetables came from the root cellar, and the afternoon was already spoken for. When lamb itself grew expensive and the slow afternoon stopped being part of the week, the neck disappeared from the meat case and the recipe disappeared from the card box. Number 11. Veal stew. Not the breaded cutlet. The slow-braised kind made from shoulder or breast of veal cut into cubes, dusted in flour, and browned gently in butter. Then the liquid went in, chicken broth and a squeeze of lemon, with a handful of pearl onions and sliced mushrooms added in the last 30 minutes. 2 hours of patient simmering turned the veal into something so tender it barely held together on the fork. The French called the classic version a blanquette, and the recipe came to American kitchens through home economics classes and community cookbooks from the 1940s through the 1970s. It was a company dinner, the kind of meal you served when the minister came over or when your daughter brought her new boyfriend to the table for the first time. Veal stew sat in a space between everyday cooking and special occasion cooking. It was not expensive enough to feel fancy, but it required enough skill and time that making it felt like an occasion in itself. The sauce had to stay light, never brown. The meat had to stay pale and delicate. You could not walk away from the stove for more than a few minutes without risking a boil that would toughen everything and break the sauce apart. When veal started disappearing from regular grocery shelves in the 1980s and the time for midweek company dinners shrank to nothing, the slow-braised veal stew lost both its audience and its raw material. The cut moved to specialty shops where it cost several times what it had at the neighborhood store. The recipe moved to the back of the card file where nobody flipped anymore. The microwave offered a different kind of company dinner. Heat a tray, set it on the table, and hope the conversation carried the evening. Number 10. Country Captain chicken. A whole chicken cut into pieces, browned in a skillet, then simmered low in a sauce of tomatoes, onions, green peppers, garlic, curry powder, and a handful of currants. 2 hours on the stove with the lid on. The chicken cooked until the meat slid off the bone and the sauce reduced into something thick, fragrant, and faintly sweet. You served it over steamed white rice and let the sauce soak in. Country Captain came into the American South through the port of Savannah sometime in the 1800s, carried by way of British colonial cooking, and it stayed on supper tables across Georgia and the Carolinas for over a century. It was the dish you made for company because it looked more complicated than it was, as long as you had the 2 hours it needed. The microwave had no answer for bone-in chicken and curry sauce. and neither did the frozen dinner aisle. Number 9. Pig feet and black-eyed peas. You bought the feet from the butcher for almost nothing, scrubbed them clean, and dropped them into a pot with dried black-eyed peas that had soaked overnight. A diced onion, a few cloves of garlic, a bay leaf, salt, and pepper. 4 hours on a low simmer. The collagen in the feet broke down and turned the cooking liquid thick and sticky, while the peas softened into a creamy mass that tasted richer than anything built from a cut that cost that little. Black families across the Deep South served this on New Year's Day for luck and on regular weeknights because it was filling and cheap. The feet never looked elegant on the plate, and when the next generation started judging supper by appearance, the pig feet stayed at the store. Number 8. Ham hock and collard greens. A smoked ham hock dropped into a deep pot of water with a bundle of collard greens, a splash of cider vinegar, and a pinch of red pepper flakes. 3 hours on a low boil. The greens cooked down to a fraction of their original volume and turned silky, soaking up the smoky broth until every leaf tasted like the ham itself. The liquid left behind, the pot liquor, was treated like a second course. You soaked cornbread in it or drank it straight from a mug. Greens and ham hock fed families across the rural South for generations, and the meal carried weight far beyond nutrition. It was Sunday supper, New Year's Day, and come home from the hospital food all in one pot. The microwave could warm up canned greens in 2 minutes flat, but the pot liquor never survived the translation. Number 7. Navy bean soup with a ham bone. After the Sunday ham was carved down to the bone went into a stock pot with a pound of dried navy beans that had soaked overnight, a diced onion, 2 stalks of celery, and enough water to cover everything by a few inches. You brought it to a boil, dropped the heat to a bare simmer, and left it alone for 4 hours. The beans broke down until half of them had dissolved into the broth, and the other half held their shape just enough to give the soup body. The ham bone gave up every remaining scrap of meat and every trace of smoky flavor it had left, and by supper time the pot held something so thick you could stand a ladle in it. This was Monday soup across most of the country, the meal that cost nothing because the ham had already been paid for on Sunday. When Sunday hams shrank to deli slices and weeknight cooking shrank to whatever the microwave could handle in 5 minutes, the Monday bean pot went cold for good. Number 6. Chicken bog. In the low country of South Carolina, chicken bog was what happened when a whole chicken, a pot of rice, and an afternoon had nowhere else to be. You simmered the chicken in salted water for 2 hours until the meat fell off the bone, pulled the carcass out, stirred rice into the broth, and let it cook down until the rice had absorbed everything and turned into a thick, sticky mass somewhere between pilaf and porridge. Smoked sausage went in depending on the family. The dish got its name from the boggy, swampy texture of the finished rice, and every household in the PD region had a version. Churches served it in sheet pans at fundraisers. Family reunions cooked it in iron wash pots over open fires. Chicken bog needed time and a whole bird, and when boneless chicken and instant rice arrived on the same grocery shelf in the 1980s, the bog dried up. Slow cooking taught something that no instruction manual ever printed on the side of a microwave box. It taught waiting. Standing near a pot for 4 hours, checking the lid, smelling the change in the steam, knowing by instinct when the meat was close. That was a kind of knowledge passed down at the stove, not from a cookbook. A child who watched her mother check the broth every half hour learned something about patience that went further than food. She learned that worth and speed are not the same thing. The microwave taught the opposite. It taught efficiency, and the idea that waiting was a flaw in the system rather than a feature of it. Both lessons stuck with the people who learned them. Only one of them ever made supper worth sitting down for. Number 5. Beef and noodles. You started with a cheap cut of chuck, browned it in a Dutch oven, covered it with water, and let it simmer for 3 hours until the beef fell apart into shreds. Then you pulled the meat out, dropped wide egg noodles into the rich, beefy broth, and cooked them until they were soft and swollen. The shredded beef went back in, salt, pepper, and nothing else. Midwestern families from Indiana to Iowa made this on cold weeknights all through the fall and winter. Some served it over mashed potatoes, which made no logical sense and tasted perfect. The dish had no pedigree and no French name. It was just slow-cooked beef in its own broth poured over noodles, and it required the 3 hours that the 1980s kitchen could no longer spare. When the microwave could reheat a plate of leftover pasta in 90 seconds, nobody wanted to start a pot of beef at 2 in the afternoon for a supper that would not be ready until 5. Number 4. Braised beef tongue. Most people alive today have never seen a whole beef tongue at a butcher counter. But through the 1970s, tongue was a standard cut at shops across the country. You simmered it in water with onion, celery, and bay leaves for 3 to 4 hours until the thick outer skin peeled away clean. The meat underneath was dense, fine-grained, and so tender it melted against the roof of your mouth. Sliced thin and served cold on rye bread with sharp mustard, or hot with horseradish sauce and boiled potatoes on the side, Jewish delicatessens, German-American households, and Mexican-American families all had their own traditions with tongue. The cut was cheap, rich in flavor, and required nothing except a long, patient braise. When convenience took over, tongue was one of the first things to go, not because it stopped tasting good, but because it stopped looking like something the next generation recognized as food. Number 3. Slow-simmered spaghetti and meatballs. The jarred sauce took over so completely that most people forgot what the original required. You started with whole canned tomatoes crushed by hand, garlic, olive oil, and a pinch of sugar. That sauce went on the stove in the morning. The meatballs, a mix of ground beef and pork with soaked bread, egg, and grated cheese, went in raw around noon and simmered in the sauce until evening. 6 hours minimum. The tomatoes broke down into something dark and concentrated, and the meatballs absorbed the sauce from the outside in while releasing their fat back into the pot. Italian-American families across the Northeast treated Sunday sauce as a ritual, not a recipe. When the jar replaced the pot, the 6-hour sauce became a story older relatives told instead of a meal the household still made. Number 2. Oven-braised beef brisket. A full flat-cut brisket rubbed with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and paprika, seared on both sides in a roasting pan, then surrounded by sliced onions and covered tight with foil. Into the oven at 275 degrees for 8 hours. The low, slow heat broke down the tough connective tissue until the grain of the meat loosened and every slice pulled apart with almost no resistance. The onions melted into a dark, sweet bed underneath, and the pan juices turned into a concentrated gravy that needed nothing added. Jewish American families served brisket on holidays. Texan families served it on any day worth sitting down for. The cut never disappeared, but the 8-hour braise gave way to quicker methods that delivered something edible, though never quite the same. Number 1. Slow-roasted pork shoulder, the cheapest large roast at the butcher counter and the one that rewarded patience more than any other cut in the case. A bone-in shoulder rubbed with salt and set in a roasting pan with nothing else, into the oven before sunrise. By noon, the fat cap had rendered, and the kitchen smelled like a holiday, even if it was a Wednesday. By 3 in the afternoon, the meat pulled away from the bone in long, soft strands that did not need a knife or a fork. Pork shoulder asked for nothing except a low oven and a morning you were willing to give it. Families roasted shoulders for church suppers, family reunions, and Tuesday dinners when nobody needed a reason. The roast fed 10 people. The leftovers made sandwiches for 3 days. The bone went into soup the following week. When the microwave took over and the oven started collecting dust, the pork shoulder lost its morning. And the smell that used to pull people into the kitchen from every room of the house stopped filling the hallway because nobody had the time to give a piece of meat the only thing it ever asked for. Number 19. Catfish stew. The catfish came out of the creek, not the store. You caught them on trot lines or sat on the bank with a cane pole and a chicken liver until something pulled. Once you had a few good ones, you skinned them, filleted them, and cut the meat into chunks. The stew started with bacon grease in a Dutch oven. You fried onions and potatoes until they were soft, added water, dropped in the catfish, and let the whole thing simmer until the fish was flaky and the broth turned thick. Some people added a can of tomatoes. Others kept it plain. You ate it with cornbread and nothing else. That stew was thick enough to hold a spoon straight up, and the catfish gave it a sweetness you could not get from any other meat. Number 16. Colcannon. Irish families brought this dish across the Atlantic and kept making it in tenement kitchens from Boston to Philadelphia. You boiled potatoes and cabbage separately, mashed the potatoes with a little butter or milk if you had it, then folded the cooked cabbage right in. The whole thing came together in a single bowl, pale green and white, soft enough that you did not even need a knife. Some families made a well in the center of the mashed potatoes and dropped in a spoonful of melted butter that pooled there like a small golden lake. You dragged your fork through the butter and the potatoes together. Colcannon was Monday supper, Wednesday supper, Friday supper. It cost almost nothing and left everyone at the table full. It showed up whenever the week called for it. Number 18. Canned salmon patties. She drained the can, picked out the bones and skin, mashed the fish with a fork, mixed in a beaten egg and a handful of crushed crackers, shaped it into patties, and fried them in a hot skillet. Both sides golden brown. The whole process took 8 minutes, and the patties came out with a crust that cracked when you bit through it. She served them with ketchup or tartar sauce or nothing at all. Canned salmon was cheaper than fresh fish in every part of the country, and these patties showed up at supper tables from Oregon to Georgia without anyone writing down instructions. Number 15. Poke salad. The pokeweed plant grew everywhere, along roadsides, at the edges of fields, behind barns, in ditches. It came up fast every spring, with thick green leaves and purple stems that could reach 6 feet by midsummer. And every part of that plant was poisonous. The berries could kill a child. The roots could kill a grown man. Even the leaves, if you picked them after the stems turned purple, carried enough toxin to make you violently sick. But people ate it anyway, because in April, when the garden was bare and the cellar was running low, those young poke shoots were the first green thing out of the ground. You picked the leaves small and bright green before the plant got any height, then you boiled them 3 times, changing the water after each boil to pull the poison out. 3 full boils, 3 full drains. After the 3rd one, you squeezed the greens dry, chopped them up, and fried them in bacon grease with scrambled eggs. That was poke salad. Some called it poke salette, from the old French word for cooked green dish. The taste was somewhere between spinach and asparagus, earthier, with a bitterness the bacon grease smoothed out. Communities across eastern Kentucky and southwest Virginia held poke dinners in church basements every spring. The older women taught the younger ones which leaves to pick and which to leave alone. One wrong choice could send you to the hospital. People trusted their mothers and their grandmothers, and they ate that plant for generations without a second thought. Tony Joe White wrote a song about it in 1968. He called it Poke Salad Annie, and it became a hit because millions of people in the rural South knew exactly what he was singing about. That plant was groceries when there were no groceries, and the women who cooked it knew the line between supper and poison by heart. Number 11. Potato and cheese pie. A cast iron skillet lined with sliced potatoes, thin slices of whatever hard cheese you had, usually a cheddar or a dry jack, another layer of potatoes, a pour of milk, and into the oven until the top browned and the cheese melted down through every layer. Farm families in New England and the upper Midwest baked this when the root cellar was running low and the cheese wheel was the richest thing they owned. The pie baked slowly, and the cheese turned stringy and golden between the potato layers. You cut it into wedges like a regular pie and served it with nothing on the side. One skillet fed 4 people. The cheese made it feel like a small luxury when it was really just 2 ingredients and time. Number 25. Tomato sandwich. 2 slices of white bread, a thick slice of tomato from the garden, mayonnaise, salt and pepper. That was the whole thing. She did not toast the bread. She did not add lettuce. She let the tomato juice soak into the soft bread until the bottom slice turned pink. And that was exactly how it was supposed to be. In the South, this was a summer supper all by itself. You ate it standing over the sink because it dripped, and you made a second one because the first one was gone before you realized you were still hungry. Nobody timed these meals. There was no stopwatch on the counter, no cooking show counting down the seconds. 10 minutes was not a challenge. It was just life. A woman who had been working all day, or watching children all day, or doing both, walked into her kitchen at 5:30 in the afternoon and fed people. She did not plan it. She opened a cabinet and looked at what was there, the way a carpenter looks at a scrap pile and sees a shelf. The speed was not the point. The speed was a side effect of having done the same thing 1,000 times with the same handful of ingredients. These were not shortcuts. They were the original meals, the ones that existed before cooking became complicated. Number 23. Soup beans with chow chow. Soup beans meant pinto beans, and in Appalachia they cooked all day. You sorted them the night before, picking out the rocks and the shriveled ones. Soaked them overnight, drained them in the morning, and set them on the stove with a chunk of salt pork. By supper time, the house smelled like something sacred. The chow chow came out of a mason jar, bright and tangy, a pickled relish made from the end of the garden. Green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, and peppers, all chopped fine and put up in late summer. You spooned it right on top of those beans. The sweet and sour cut through all that rich, smoky pork flavor in a way that made every bite different from the last. Number 20. Scalloped potatoes with canned evaporated milk. You sliced potatoes thin, layered them in a greased baking dish, poured a can of evaporated milk over the top, dusted it all with flour, salt, and pepper, and baked it until the top browned and the milk thickened into a sauce that clung to every slice. This was the supper that showed up when company came and you had nothing special in the house. The evaporated milk gave it a richness that regular milk could not match, and the flour kept the whole thing from being soupy. Families in the Midwest and Plains states served this on Sunday nights when the big meal had already been served at noon. You pulled the dish out of the oven, set it on a folded towel, and let people serve themselves. Nobody asked what else was for dinner. Number 21. Fried potatoes and onions. She peeled 2 potatoes, sliced them thin, and dropped them into a skillet with a sliced onion and a spoonful of lard. Covered it with a lid and let it cook until the bottom layer turned crisp and brown. Flipped the whole thing once. Salt and pepper on top, maybe a splash of vinegar if the family was from the right part of the country. This was a full supper on a Friday night when the icebox held nothing else, and it tasted good enough that nobody minded. The whole skillet was empty in 10 minutes. Number 11. Baked cushaw squash. The cushaw was an enormous striped squash, green and white, shaped like a long crook neck, and it could grow to 30 pounds or more. It was an Appalachian heirloom that almost nobody outside the mountains had ever seen. You split it open, scooped out the seeds, laid the halves in a roasting pan, and baked it slow. When it was done, the flesh was golden and smooth, somewhere between pumpkin and sweet potato. You scooped it out and mashed it with butter and a little salt. Some families added brown sugar. I think cushaw deserves more attention than it gets. People grew them because they stored beautifully in the root cellar, and a single one could feed a family for a week. There was a kind of dignity in feeding yourself from what you grew. Nobody talked about it that way at the time. Nobody called it self-sufficient or sustainable. Those words came later, from somewhere else. But the act itself, walking into your own garden, pulling food from the ground, cooking it in your own kitchen, and setting it on the table for people you loved, that was the whole point. It did not matter that the meal was simple. What mattered was that you made it. That you showed up at the stove when you were tired and your back hurt and nothing about it was glamorous. You fed your family because that is what you did. The food was plain, but the act was not. Number 12. Bubble and squeak. Last night's mashed potatoes and whatever boiled cabbage or Brussels sprouts were left over got pressed together into a thick cake and fried in a skillet until both sides turned dark and crisp. The name came from the sound it made in the pan, bubbling and squeaking as the moisture cooked out. English working-class families brought this to America, and it stuck in mill towns and factory neighborhoods where nothing in the kitchen ever went to waste. The outside crust shattered when you cut into it, and the inside was soft and steaming. Some families fried an egg alongside and put the whole thing on one plate. breakfast or supper, depending on the time of day. Bubble and Squeak asked for nothing but leftovers and a hot skillet. Number 28. Egg in a hole. She tore a circle out of the middle of a slice of bread with a juice glass, buttered both sides, and laid it in a hot skillet. Cracked an egg right into the hole. The bread toasted golden while the egg set underneath it, and the little round cutout fried beside it like a bonus. Some people called it a bird's nest. Others called it a one-eyed jack. Your grandmother probably called it supper. It took 3 minutes and used 1 egg, 1 slice of bread, and a pat of butter. The whole thing fit in your hand. Number 22. Fried ramps and potatoes. Every spring when the snow melted off the north-facing slopes, the ramps came up. They grew wild under poplar trees in the rich bottomland, and people dug them by the sackful. The smell was somewhere between garlic and onion, but stronger than both. You sliced the bulbs thin, chopped the green tops, and fried everything in a cast iron skillet with diced potatoes and bacon grease. The ramps turned sweet when they hit the heat. The potatoes crisped around the edges. In towns like Richwood, West Virginia, there were ramp suppers at the fire hall every April. You could smell who had been eating them from across the parking lot. Nobody cared. That was the price of spring, and it was worth paying. Number 25. Creamed potatoes on toast. You boiled potatoes until they were soft enough to mash with the back of a fork, then stirred in a splash of milk and a spoonful of flour to make a thick white sauce right in the pot. You spooned that over a slice of toasted bread and called it supper. Nothing else on the plate. No meat, no vegetable, no garnish. Families across the Ohio Valley and the upper Midwest ate this 2 or 3 nights a week when the money ran thin and the garden was frozen shut. The toast soaked up the cream and turned soft underneath while the top stayed warm and thick. Children scraped the plate clean and never once asked what else there was, because there was nothing else. A loaf of bread and a bag of potatoes kept a household standing through January. Number 24. Potato and sauerkraut skillet. You sliced potatoes thin, layered them in a cast iron skillet with jarred sauerkraut and a spoonful of lard, and let the whole thing cook low and slow until the edges browned and the kraut softened into the starch. The sourness of the cabbage cut through the heaviness of the potato, and the combination stretched a single jar of sauerkraut and 4 potatoes into enough food for a family of 6. German and Czech families across the plains states made this every week from October through April. You did not need seasoning beyond what the kraut already carried. Salt was built in. The lard gave it richness. When you flipped sections with a spatula, the bottom had gone crisp and golden, and that was the best part. Number 19. Open-face tuna melt. She drained a can of tuna, mixed it with mayonnaise and a squeeze of mustard, spread it on a slice of bread, and laid a piece of American cheese on top. Put the whole thing under the broiler until the cheese bubbled and turned brown at the edges. That was it. 5 minutes from can to table, and it came out of the oven looking like something a diner would charge you real money for. The bread stayed soft underneath and crunchy at the edges where the cheese had dripped over. She served it on a plate with a pickle on the side, or she served it on a paper towel with nothing at all. The tuna melt lived in diners and lunch counters all over this country for decades. Waitresses did not even write down the order because everyone knew what it was. But the open-face version, the one your grandmother made, was different from the diner version. She used whatever bread was in the house. She did not toast it first. She let the broiler do all the work in one pass, and the result was better than anything you could order because she knew exactly how long her oven took to brown cheese. She could tell by the smell when the edges started to darken, and she pulled the pan out at exactly the right second without setting a timer. Lunch counters across the Midwest kept a version on their menus through the 1970s, and when those counters closed, the sandwich moved back into the home kitchen where it had started. That knowledge left with her. You can still make a tuna melt today, but it will not taste the same because you will open a recipe on your phone instead of just knowing. The strange thing about these meals is that nobody thought of them as fast food. That phrase did not exist yet for most of the women who made them. There was no slow food to compare it to. There was just food. You made it when people were hungry, and you made it from what you had. The 10-minute part was invisible because the skill behind it was invisible. A woman who can peel and slice a potato in 45 seconds did not learn that from a video. She learned it from doing it every single day for 40 years. The speed was not a trick. It was muscle memory woven into hands that never stopped moving. When those hands stopped, so did the meals. Number 21. Half-runner green beans simmered with a ham hock. Half-runners were the bean of choice across the southern mountains. Not quite a pole bean and not quite a bush bean. Somewhere in between with a sweetness that snaps could not touch. You broke them by hand into pieces, dropped them into a big pot with a smoked ham hock, and let them cook for hours. Not 20 minutes. Hours. The beans turned soft and dark and soaked up every bit of smoke from that pork. The pot liquor at the bottom was worth more than the beans themselves. People sopped it up with cornbread or drank it straight from a cup. I still think a bowl of half-runners and a wedge of cornbread is one of the most honest suppers ever put on a table. The grocery store was not part of the routine, not the way it is now. The nearest store might have been 15 miles of gravel road, and the truck only made it there when the weather allowed. So the garden was the grocery store. The root cellar was the pantry. The smokehouse was the meat counter. A woman feeding a family of 6 did not write a shopping list. She walked outside and looked at what was growing, what was cured, what was canned on the shelf, and she built supper from that. If the beans were ready, you ate beans. If the squash was coming in, you ate squash. The menu was never a choice. It was an answer to a question the land asked every single day. Number 21. Potato and navy bean stew. A bag of dried navy beans cost a few cents and sat in the cupboard until you needed it, which in winter was often. You soaked the beans overnight, then simmered them the next day with cubed potatoes, an onion, and enough water to cover everything by an inch. The beans broke down and thickened the broth on their own. The potatoes held their shape just long enough to give you something to chew. Families in Appalachia and across the rural South made this stew every week from the first frost until the ground thawed. Some added a piece of salt pork if they had one. Most let the beans do the work alone. A single pot lasted 3 days if nobody took seconds, and nobody ever promised not to. There is something about a potato that every poor family understood without anyone having to say it out loud. 1 potato could be a meal. 5 potatoes could be a week. A sack of potatoes bought in October could carry you all the way to March if you stretched them right. No other vegetable did that. Carrots ran out. Canned corn was gone by Christmas. But potatoes sat in a cool, dark place and waited for you. They did not bruise easy. They did not rot fast. And they took on the flavor of whatever you cooked them with. A potato was never exciting. It was never supposed to be. It was supposed to keep you alive and full and warm at the table when the wind outside sounded like it wanted in. And it did. Number 13. Liverwurst sandwich. She spread liverwurst thick on rye bread or white bread, added a thin slice of onion and a smear of yellow mustard, and pressed the top slice down. The liverwurst was soft and rich and tasted like something from another country, which it was. German and Polish immigrants brought it to the Midwest, and it stayed in delis and kitchen pantries for generations. Kids either loved it or hated it. Grandmothers loved it because it required no cooking, no heat, and no time. You opened the package, spread it, and ate. Number 18. Brown beans and fatback. Brown beans were not the same as pintos. They were smaller, darker, and they had a deeper, earthier taste. In parts of Virginia and North Carolina, brown beans were what people grew because pintos did not do well in that particular soil. You cooked them the same way, sorted, soaked, simmered all day with a thick slab of fatback buried in the pot. Fatback was pure pork fat, no meat on it at all, scored with a knife so the salt could seep into the beans. By evening, those beans were so soft they fell apart on the spoon. You served them in a bowl with a wedge of cornbread and that was supper. The taste was earthier and deeper than pintos, and the people who grew up on brown beans will tell you they are the superior bean without hesitation. Number 17. Potato and kielbasa bake. In the coal towns of central Pennsylvania, families stretched a single ring of kielbasa across an entire baking dish by burying it under 2 layers of sliced potatoes, a chopped onion, and enough water to steam the whole thing in the oven. The sausage fat rendered as it cooked and soaked down into the potatoes underneath, giving every slice a smoky, garlicky richness that had no business coming from a dish that simple. You cut the kielbasa thin so every serving got some meat, even if it was just a sliver tucked between 2 soft potato slices. The dish baked for about an hour and came out bubbling. Whole neighborhoods smelled exactly like this on winter nights, and the pan was empty before it had time to cool. Number 23. Vienna sausages and beans. She opened 2 cans, dumped them into the same pot, and heated the whole thing on the stove for 4 minutes. The little sausages were soft and salty. The beans were sweet. Together, they made something that passed for supper without a single complaint from anyone at the table. She served it with bread on the side to soak up the juice, and that was the meal. It showed up in hunting cabins, fishing camps, and kitchens where the grocery money had run thin a week before payday. Number 13. Creek Bank Fish Fry. On a Friday evening in summer, you took whatever you had caught that week and fried it right there beside the water. Bluegill, smallmouth bass, brook trout, whatever the creek gave up. You cleaned the fish on a flat rock, dredged the pieces in cornmeal with salt and pepper, and fried them in a cast iron skillet set over a fire between 2 rocks. The grease was lard, brought from the house in a coffee can. The fish cooked in a few minutes, and you ate it with your fingers straight off a piece of newspaper. There was no table and no plates. Whatever you caught, you cooked. Whatever you cooked, you ate right there on the bank with your hands. Some families did this every Friday from May through September, and the children never forgot it. Number 14. Potato and egg casserole. During the hardest years of the Depression, eggs were sometimes the only protein a family could afford alongside their potatoes, and this casserole brought the two together in a baking dish that fed 6 people for almost nothing. You sliced cooked potatoes into a greased dish, cracked eggs right on top, and baked the whole thing until the whites set and the yolks were still soft enough to break with your fork. The yolk ran down into the potatoes and became the sauce. No cream, no cheese, no canned soup. Just potatoes, eggs, salt, pepper, and heat. Families in the Ohio River Valley and across the rural Midwest made this so often that their children grew up thinking every casserole had a runny egg on top. The trick was getting the timing right. Pull it out too soon and the whites were still clear. Leave it in too long and the yolks turned chalky and dry, and the whole point of the dish disappeared. Some cooks cracked the eggs into small wells pressed into the potato layer so each egg sat in its own pocket. Others laid the slices flat and let the eggs find their own place across the surface. Either way, the dish came out of the oven steaming, and you served it straight from the pan with a spatula. There was nothing elegant about it. The beauty was in what it cost and how far it went. A dozen eggs and 5 potatoes made enough supper for 2 nights, and nobody left the table hungry. On the coldest evenings, when the kitchen was the warmest room in the house, a family sitting around a table eating potato and egg casserole was not thinking about what they did not have. They were just eating together. And in those years, that was everything. Number 27. Sardines on toast. She opened the tin with the key that rolled back the lid, forked the sardines onto a piece of toast, and squeezed half a lemon over the top. Some grandmothers added a thin slice of raw onion. Others sprinkled hot sauce. The tin cost pennies and packed more protein than a pork chop. Men who worked the docks in Baltimore and Gloucester ate this at the end of a shift because it was fast, filling, and you could eat it with one hand. The taste was strong enough that some kids refused it, but the adults never stopped. Number 10. Rabbit stew. In the mountains, rabbit was not exotic. It was Tuesday. A boy old enough to carry a rifle could bring home a cottontail before school if he knew where to look. The rabbits lived in the brush piles along the fence rows and came out to feed at dawn and dusk like clockwork. You skinned them, soaked the meat in cold salted water for a few hours to pull the blood out, then cut the rabbit into pieces and browned them in a Dutch oven with lard. Onions went in next, then carrots, then potatoes cut into chunks. You added enough water to cover everything, put the lid on, and let it cook on the back of the stove for the afternoon. The meat turned tender and fell off the bone. The broth was thinner than beef stew, but it had a clean, mild flavor that nobody forgot once they tasted it. Some cooks thickened the broth with flour stirred into cold water. Others left it thin and poured it over biscuits. Rabbit stew was a dependable mountain supper. The animal was free, it reproduced faster than you could eat it, and it tasted good. There was no closed season on cottontail in most Appalachian counties back then. You hunted them when you needed them, and you needed them often. A single rabbit fed 2 people. 2 fed a family. It was the most efficient protein in those hills. I have met people in their 80s who still remember exactly how their mother's rabbit stew tasted, down to the way the carrots turned soft at the edges and the way the broth smelled when the lid came off the pot after 3 hours. That kind of memory does not fade. The people who grew up eating it never stopped craving it, and most of them never found anything that matched it. Number 22. Baked potatoes with drippings. When the only thing left in the pantry was a sack of potatoes and a jar of bacon drippings saved on the back of the stove, this is what you made. You scrubbed 2 or 3 potatoes clean, stabbed them with a fork, and baked them in a hot oven until the skins cracked. Then you split them open and spooned the drippings right inside, where the fat melted into the starch and turned the whole thing into something that tasted like it had no right being that good. No butter, no cheese, no sour cream, just potatoes and the rendered fat from last week's bacon. Families kept that jar on the back of the stove all winter, and every time they dipped a spoon into it, the level dropped a little lower. That jar of dripping stretched farther than any grocery run. Number 30. Fried bologna sandwich. She pulled 2 slices of bologna from the package, scored the edges with a knife so they would not curl, and dropped them into a dry skillet. 30 seconds aside. The meat puffed up in the center and browned at the edges, and the whole kitchen smelled like a diner at lunchtime. She laid those slices on soft white bread with yellow mustard, pressed it flat with her palm, and cut it corner to corner. No plate sometimes, just a paper towel. A kid could eat 2 of those standing at the counter before the streetlights came on, and nobody called it a recipe because it barely qualified as cooking. But it was supper, and it was ready before you washed your hands. Number 16. Fried green tomatoes as the whole supper. When the first frost was on its way and the tomatoes on the vine were still green, you picked every last one. Some went into chow chow, some got wrapped in newspaper to ripen on the windowsill, but the rest got sliced thick, dredged in cornmeal, and fried in a cast iron skillet with enough lard to come halfway up the sides. The coating turned golden and crisp. The tomato inside stayed firm and tart. In some homes, that was the entire supper: a plate of fried green tomatoes, a glass of buttermilk, and maybe a biscuit left over from breakfast. It was not a side dish. It was the main event, and when it showed up on the table, everybody knew summer was officially over. Cooking in the mountains was not something people did for fun. It was work, and it started before the sun came up. A woman stoked the fire in the wood stove, hauled water from the spring, and started something on the stove that would take all day. She did not own a timer. She had instinct. She knew the beans were done by the way the pot sounded. She knew the bread was ready by the color of the crust. There were no shortcuts because there was nothing to cut short. Everything took exactly as long as it took. And the people who sat down to eat that food understood what it cost. Not in money, in hours and in hands that never stopped moving. Number 19. Potato and bacon rind stew. The bacon was gone, eaten days ago, but the rinds stayed in a jar on the counter because you did not throw away anything that still had flavor. You dropped those rinds into a pot of water with cubed potatoes, a rough chopped onion, and whatever dried herbs you had hanging near the stove. The rinds simmered for hours, and the salt and smoke leached out into the broth until it turned cloudy and rich. The potatoes broke down at the edges and thickened everything. You fished out the rinds before serving, or you left them in for whoever wanted to chew on them. Families in the rural South and across Appalachia kept a rind jar the way other households kept a sugar bowl. Nothing left the kitchen until every last bit of taste had been pulled from it. The stew sat on the stove all day. By evening, it had reduced into something closer to a thick porridge than a soup, and you ladled it over cornbread or ate it straight from the bowl with a spoon. On the coldest nights, a second pot of water went on the stove to stretch what was left into tomorrow's lunch. A bag of potatoes, a jar of rinds, and an afternoon of patience turned into something worth sitting down for. Number 16. Hot dog and baked beans. She boiled 2 hot dogs in a small pot, opened a can of baked beans, heated them in a saucepan, and put the whole thing on a plate. Some grandmothers sliced the hot dogs into the beans and served it as a stew. Others kept them separate with a piece of bread on the side. Either way, the meal took less time than setting the table. Church camps served this to 100 kids at once. Families served it on nights when nobody felt like trying. It was honest food that filled a stomach and asked nothing in return. Number 20. Cracklin' cornbread with a mess of greens. When a hog was butchered in late fall, nothing went to waste. The skin and the fat were cut into small pieces and rendered in a big iron pot over an open fire. What came out were cracklings, golden brown nuggets of pork that were crispy on the outside and impossibly rich on the inside. Those cracklings went straight into the cornbread batter. You mixed your cornmeal with a little flour, buttermilk, an egg if you had one, a pinch of soda, and a generous handful of those cracklings. Then you poured the batter into a screaming hot skillet greased with lard and baked it until the top cracked and the edges turned dark brown. That cornbread was heavier than the regular kind, saltier, with little bursts of pork flavor in every bite. You could hear the cracklings crunch when you bit down. On the side, there was always a mess of greens, turnip greens, mustard greens, creasy greens, whatever was growing along the fence or in the garden. You cooked them low and slow in a deep pot with a piece of smoked jowl and a splash of vinegar. They cooked down to a fraction of their original size. A whole bushel of raw greens barely filled a serving bowl. You tore off pieces of cornbread and dragged them through the pot liquor pooled on your plate. The combination worked because the cracklings brought salt and fat and crunch, and the greens brought iron and bitterness and depth. One without the other was fine. Together, they were something worth sitting down for. In a lot of homes, this was Saturday supper from November through March. The cracklings made that cornbread feel like a feast, even when there was not a single other thing on the table. Number 18. Potato dumplings in broth. You boiled potatoes until they were soft enough to mash with a fork, worked in a handful of flour and 1 egg, and rolled the dough into balls the size of a walnut. Then you dropped them into simmering beef broth or chicken broth, whichever you had, and let them cook until they floated. Czech and German families in the upper Midwest made these dumplings all winter long, sometimes as the only thing in the bowl, and sometimes alongside a piece of boiled meat that had been simmering since morning. The dumplings were dense and filling, and the broth soaked into them so every bite carried the taste of whatever stock you had built. You did not need many. 4 or 5 dumplings in a deep bowl of broth and a piece of bread was a full supper for a grown man coming in from the cold. Number 20. Peanut butter and banana sandwich. She spread peanut butter thick on 1 slice of bread, laid banana coins across it, and pressed the second slice on top. No toasting, no honey, no fuss. A kid could eat this for supper and sleep full. Grandmother served it with a glass of milk and called it done. It needed no heat, no cleanup, and no skill beyond opening a jar. The combination sounds like a snack, but in households where supper had to be fast and cheap, this was the meal. Elvis made a fried version famous, but the original was simpler and quicker and belonged to every grandmother who ever ran out of time. Number 14. Cornfield beans and new potatoes. Cornfield beans were planted right alongside the corn. The vines climbed the stalks, and by midsummer you had both crops in the same row. The beans were picked young, when the pods were still tender, and cooked fresh with small new potatoes dug from the edge of the garden. You put everything in a pot with water, a piece of smoked pork, and a little salt. It simmered until the potatoes were soft enough to break apart with a fork and the beans had turned silky. The broth was thin but full of flavor. This was a July supper. The potatoes were barely bigger than a walnut. The beans still had dirt on them 20 minutes before they hit the pot. Number 15. Potato hash with whatever meat was left. You chopped last night's boiled or baked potatoes rough and fried them in a hot skillet with whatever scrap of meat the week had left behind. A bit of roast beef, a slice of ham from Sunday, a few pieces of chicken pulled off the bone. The potatoes crisped on the bottom while the meat warmed through, and the whole thing came together in about 10 minutes. This was the meal that cleaned out the icebox before grocery day. Families did not call it hash because it sounded fancy. They called it hash because you hashed everything together and hoped it tasted all right. It always did. The crispy bits at the bottom of the skillet were the best part, and everyone at the table knew it. Whoever got the last scrape of the pan won the evening. Winter had a way of teaching you what a potato could really do. In the first cold week, you might have roasted a chicken or made a stew with real beef. By the third week, the meat was gone and the vegetables from the garden had been eaten or canned months ago. What was left was potatoes, and that was when the real cooking started. The women who fed families through those months did not follow trends or read food magazines. They stood at a counter and looked at what they had. A handful of potatoes, maybe an onion, a little flour, a spoonful of fat, and they made supper out of it every single night without repeating themselves more than they had to. That kind of cooking does not have a name in any cookbook. It has a season, and the season was always winter. Number 22. Cornbread crumbled in buttermilk. She took a piece of leftover cornbread, broke it into a tall glass, and poured cold buttermilk over the top. Ate it with a spoon. In the rural South, this was supper, breakfast, and a midnight snack, depending on the hour. The cornbread softened in the buttermilk until it was halfway between cereal and pudding, tangy and filling and gone in 3 minutes. Some families added a sliced green onion on top. Others sprinkled black pepper. It required no heat, no cooking, and no explanation to anyone who grew up eating it. Number 24. Cornbread crumbled in sweet milk. You took a piece of leftover cornbread, broke it into a tall glass, and poured cold milk over the top. Then you ate it with a spoon. That was supper. It sounds like nothing, but in the mountains of North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, this was what people ate when the real meal had already been served at noon. Dinner was the big meal in the middle of the day. Supper was lighter, and for a lot of families, cornbread and milk was exactly enough. The cornbread soaked up the milk and turned soft, almost like pudding. Children loved it. Old folks still talk about it like it was the best thing they ever tasted. Every recipe on this list still works exactly the way it did 40 years ago. Pick one this weekend. Set the pot on the burner in the morning and let the house fill up with something worth coming home to. You do not need a special occasion. You just need a heavy pot and a morning where nobody is rushing you. If you remember any of these suppers, leave the name in the comments. And if you know someone who still cooks one of them, share this video with them. Until next time.